The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights buzzed above as the aging German shepherd moved slowly across the concrete floor, his nails clicking like a metronome counting down the final seconds of something he didn't understand. Ranger didn't resist the leash. He never did. His gait was stiff, a limp in his left hind leg from a shrapnel injury no one here could explain. His eyes were clouded at the edges, but they still scanned every corner like they had back in the field. Focused, alert, waiting for a command that would never come again. A staff member walked in with a kind of practiced detachment, one hand on the lead, the other holding a clipboard marked E7 4 p.m. Around here, E didn't stand for elite. It stood for euthanasia. Ranger was out of time. No one had come for him. He'd been dropped off by animal control 6 months earlier. No tags, just a chipped ID that linked back to a decommissioned military base, and a file with more redactions than answers. Shelter staff tried. He got a chance like the others, but he didn't wag at children or chase tennis balls. He didn't play the part of the friendly, hopeful dog they could market on flyers. He just watched and waited. And when anyone got too close, he backed away slowly, as if guarding a memory no one else could see. The staff member gave a quiet sigh, reaching the last door at the end of the hallway. She paused, hand on the knob, and looked down at him. "Sorry, boy," she murmured. "Nobody showed up?" Ranger didn't move. He just sat down, ears flicking toward a sound behind them. The front bell had chimed. Someone had entered. The woman glanced back over her shoulder, not expecting anyone important. The shelter rarely got walk-ins on a Tuesday afternoon. But the man who stepped through the door wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't lost. He walked with purpose, shoulders squared, eyes scanning with the kind of presence you couldn't teach. JD Vance had only planned to stop in for 5 minutes. A local vet had told him about the shelter's underfunded veteran outreach program, and JD, passing through on a quiet trip home, thought he'd see it for himself. But the second he stepped inside and caught sight of the shepherd being led down that hallway, he stopped. Dead still. Ranger turned at the same time. Their eyes locked for just a moment. Something passed between them. Not recognition. Not yet. But something deeper. JD tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. Then he pointed toward the hallway. "That dog, what's happening with him?" The staff at the desk glanced at the clipboard, then back at him. "He's scheduled. We've tried everything. Nobody wants him." JD looked again. Harder this time, and without thinking, he stepped forward. "Well," he said quietly, "maybe somebody does now." And just like that, the clock stopped ticking. JD Vance had walked through plenty of doors in his life, some where he was expected, others where he wasn't. But this one, the worn metal frame of a rural shelter's back corridor, felt heavier than most. He didn't come to adopt a dog. He came out of courtesy after a local veterinarian told him the shelter had been trying to launch a veteran outreach initiative but couldn't get the funding, couldn't get the visibility. He thought he'd shake a few hands, maybe offer some advice. He didn't expect to stop cold in front of kennel number 16. The dog inside didn't bark, didn't pace. Just sat there, eyes locked forward, posture still and silent. His coat was thick but dull in patches, and his ears twitched once at the sound of JD's boots on the floor. But it wasn't the eyes that made JD freeze. It was the scar, a jagged, crescent-shaped burn across the dog's left flank, long-healed but unmistakably violent. JD had seen one just like it. Different war, different country, but the memory came rushing back with the clarity of a bullet's whistle. Kandahar. Dust thick enough to choke, the roar of gunfire behind him, and a canine named Shadow who lunged ahead to sniff out an IED buried where the road bent hard. Shadow had survived that day, barely, pulled from the wreckage by his handler with a matching scar carved into his side, a signature left behind by the blast. JD hadn't thought about that dog in years, but the second he saw Ranger's scar, his mind flooded with the image. It wasn't just a similar injury, it was identical. JD stepped closer, slowly, instinctively keeping his movements calm. The dog's ears flicked again, but he didn't back away. Didn't growl, just stared. Deep, unmoving, waiting. "What's his name?" JD asked the staff member beside him. She looked at the chart clipped to the gate. "Ranger. Came in months ago. Picked up near a train yard. Microchip led to."
An old military logistics office, but nobody claimed him. No family listed, nothing. JD crouched slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog's. "You said nobody wanted him." She nodded. "He's been passed over a dozen times. Doesn't do well with strangers, shows signs of trauma, some aggression. Too risky to adopt out." JD didn't respond right away. He was staring into Ranger's eyes now, eyes that didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't beg. Just waited. Eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. JD felt something tighten in his chest. "This dog isn't broken," he said quietly. "He's trained. He's working. He's just waiting for orders." Ranger didn't move, but his ears turned slightly toward the sound of JD's voice. "Yeah," JD whispered, a memory surfacing like smoke. "You've been out there." For a moment, everything else in the shelter faded. The noise, the scent of bleach and steel, the chatter down the hall. All that remained was a scar, a stare, and a second chance no one saw coming. But JD did. And now he couldn't walk away. JD didn't leave the shelter that day. Not right away. Not with that scar burned into his memory, and those eyes still following him down the hall like a silent request. He stood at the front desk, arms folded, voice calm, but edged with something firmer now. "I need everything you've got on the dog in Kennel 16. Ranger." The receptionist blinked. "Sir, we don't usually—" "I'm not asking for classified records," JD interrupted. "Just a copy of what's on file." A few minutes later, he sat in the small, cramped office just past intake, flipping through a thin manila folder filled with intake notes, scanned paperwork, and a few grainy photos. What struck him wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. The records showed Ranger had been found limping near a freight yard 2 towns over, picked up by animal control after someone reported an aggressive stray wandering too close to children. The microchip had pinged back to a military base in Louisiana, decommissioned 4 years ago. No active personnel, no handler listed, no next of kin. JD tapped the photo, clipped to the front. Ranger standing against a cinder block wall, ears pinned back, posture tense. "You see this?" he asked the shelter director, who had joined him, with arms crossed and eyes wary. "This isn't a stray. This dog worked. He was trained, disciplined. That's a war dog. Or I'm blind." The director shrugged. "Could be. We see all kinds come through here. Once the chip didn't link to an owner, we had no way to confirm anything else. We don't have access to military records, and the bases don't respond to us." JD nodded slowly, his mind already turning. "But he was chipped through the military system?" "Yes, that much we know." JD's jaw tightened. "Then that's enough to start." It didn't take long. A call to a former contact. A favor from someone who still had access to certain channels. Within hours, JD had a name. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan, K9 Unit, Operation Iron Shield, handler of a German Shepherd named Ranger. JD leaned back in his seat as the information hit him. The file came with a date, one that made his chest go cold. Staff Sergeant Brennan had passed away 11 months ago from a heart attack in his sleep. No spouse, no kids, no family listed beyond a brother overseas. And just like that, the link had snapped. JD looked back down at the photo. No one came for him, he murmured, because the one person who would have died before letting that happen already did. With no handler, no paperwork, and no advocate, Ranger was absorbed into the system. And when the system didn't know what to do with him, it did what it always does. It forgot. JD set the folder down gently. He wasn't aggressive, he said quietly. He was grieving. The shelter director didn't speak. She didn't have to. Because in that moment, JD wasn't looking at a forgotten dog anymore. He was looking at a soldier who'd been left behind. And he wasn't going to let that happen again. The office smelled like paper and bleach, the kind of clean that tried to scrub out guilt but never quite could. JD stood by the door, folder still in hand, as the shelter director shifted behind her desk, tapping a pen against her clipboard like punctuation for a sentence she hadn't spoken yet. He waited, silent, watching her. Finally, she exhaled, heavy and rehearsed. "Look, Mr. Vance, I understand where you're coming from. I do. But this dog, he's not safe. He's lunged at 3 volunteers, growled at 2 staff members. He doesn't do well with unfamiliar people. We're a shelter, not a rehab facility." JD didn't flinch. He's not dangerous. He's trained. He's waiting for someone to give the right command. And until someone gives that command, she said, voice flattening, he's a liability. JD stepped forward, lowering the file onto her desk like a final piece of evidence. His handler died last year. No one came for him because the only person who would have is buried 6 states away. This isn't just some stray. He's military. The director nodded slowly. And military or not, we're overcrowded. We're already over capacity by 12 dogs. We have 3 court-ordered intakes arriving tomorrow, and 2 of our isolation kennels are still under repair from the storm. We don't have the space, Mr. Vance, and we can't make exceptions, not even for a senator. JD didn't correct her. He didn't bring up the weight his name could carry or the headlines his voice could spark. He didn't threaten or plead. He just looked through the glass window beside them, looked at Ranger, curled quietly in the far corner of his kennel, not asleep, not resting, just waiting in that same tense stillness that said he hadn't stopped listening since the day they brought him in. JD pushed away from the desk. "Just give me 5 minutes. Sir, I'm not asking you to change policy. I'm asking you to give me 5 minutes with him." The director hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. JD walked through the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached the kennel, he didn't speak right away. He just knelt down, eyes level with Ranger's. The dog raised his head slightly. Not aggressive, not afraid, just aware. JD leaned in a little closer. "They said no one wanted you," he said quietly. "They said you were too old, too angry, too broken." Ranger didn't move. His ears flicked, his breathing steady. "They're wrong." JD's voice dropped even lower, like muscle memory pulling his tone from years ago. "You did your job. You waited. Now you need to hear something familiar." He took a breath, then said a single word, clear and firm. "Stay." Ranger froze. Then slowly his body softened. His eyes locked on JD's with something that wasn't obedience, but trust. JD rose, turned back toward the office, and spoke calmly. "He's not going anywhere." The shelter director looked up. "We can't hold him." JD didn't blink. "Then I will." The sun had barely lifted past the horizon when JD Vance returned to the shelter the next morning, the wheels of a modest camera cart rumbling behind him across the gravel lot. No flashy crew, just one cameraman and a woman with a mic clipped to her collar. both veterans themselves, both briefed on exactly what this was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a takedown. It was a witness statement for a dog that couldn't speak for himself and a country that had stopped listening too soon. The shelter staff watched with cautious eyes as JD made his way back to Kennel 16. Ranger was already up, sitting calmly as if he'd known he was expected. His ears twitched when JD knelt again by the door, and for the first time, his tail gave a slow, uncertain wag. "You ready, soldier?" JD asked quietly. Ranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crew set up in under 10 minutes. No lights, no makeup, just natural morning beams bleeding through the metal rafters and falling onto the scratched floor like stage lighting meant for something more sacred. The camera started rolling. JD stood back, no script in hand, just instinct. He gave the first command, crisp and deliberate. "Sit." Ranger lowered himself in one smooth motion, posture perfect. "Down." The dog followed without hesitation. "Watch." Ranger locked eyes with JD and held the stare, his body still, his breathing low, every inch of him alert, present, waiting for what would come next. JD gave the final cue. At ease. And only then did Ranger's shoulders soften, head dipping gently forward, eyes blinking like a soldier, standing down for the first time in years. The clip lasted 42 seconds. No voiceover, no music, just Ranger, responding, remembering, and reminding everyone who watched that this wasn't just a dog on a concrete floor. This was a trained war veteran, abandoned not by cruelty, but by a system that didn't know how to hold on to someone who gave everything and asked for nothing. JD posted the video with one line. He remembered every command. We just forgot to remember him. Within the hour, the numbers ticked up. A few thousand views, then 10, then 100. By nightfall, the clip had crossed 1 million. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Comments poured in. Former handlers, retired military, families of soldiers, all saying the same thing. That dog knew. That dog served. That dog matters. JD didn't respond to most of them. He just refreshed the page once and watched as the world, piece by piece, began to understand what he saw the moment he knelt by that kennel. A hero. Forgotten. Until now. JD's office was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes early in the morning before emails start firing and decisions start stacking. He stood by the window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the fog burn off the Capitol dome across the skyline when his assistant stepped in, phone in hand, eyes wide with something urgent but respectful. "It's a Colonel McAdams," she said. "Retired. Said it's about the dog." JD set his mug down slowly and took the phone. "This is JD." The voice on the other end was gravel and steel. "Senator Vance, I saw the footage. The dog, Ranger. That's not just a K9, that's Bravo 7. JD's brow furrowed. "You know him?" "Knew him, not personally, but I know what he did. Operation Iron Shield, Afghanistan, 2014. He was with Brennan's team, Explosives Detection Unit. I was running logistics out of Bagram. That dog is why 2 of our convoys made it out alive. He flagged a buried series of IEDs on Highway Black. The entire path was wired to blow." JD sat down slowly, heart tightening in his chest. "I just found out his handler died last year. No one claimed him." The colonel exhaled hard. "His records got buried. When Brennan passed, The system flagged Ranger as decommissioned, but someone failed to update his service classification. No one followed the trail. It was a clerical error, one box left unchecked, and he disappeared from the database. That's why he ended up at that shelter. Forgotten. JD's jaw clenched. You're telling me a decorated war dog, who saved lives, was almost euthanized because of a paperwork error? That's exactly what I'm telling you. There was a pause. But not anymore. We're fixing it. I've already called into the DoD. We're reinstating his record, confirming his commendations, and issuing a formal statement. But more importantly, thank you. If you hadn't posted that video, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. JD looked out the window again, this time seeing something else in the rising light. I didn't do anything special, he said quietly. I just didn't look away. The colonel's voice softened. That's more than most. When they hung up, JD stayed seated, the weight of it all settling in. Somewhere down the hall, the hum of printers and office chatter resumed. But in that room, the silence was earned. Ranger wasn't just a nameless dog anymore. He had a unit, a mission, a record. And now, he had a story that no one could erase. The world had remembered him. But only because one man had stopped, knelt, and looked beyond a scar to see the soldier still waiting underneath. The box wasn't labeled. It sat in the corner of the shelter's back storage room, half buried beneath a pile of retired leashes and worn blankets, its cardboard edges soft from water damage and time. A young volunteer, sorting supplies for the afternoon intake, pulled it out without thinking, brushing off a layer of dust as she popped the top open. Inside were a pair of worn boots, a faded collar, and a folded American flag with frayed stitching. But at the very bottom, tucked beneath a layer of camo fabric, was something else. An envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just 3 words written in shaky block letters across the front. To whoever finds him. She brought it to the front. No one wanted to open it at first, but JD happened to be on site that day, finalizing paperwork for Ranger's official release. When he saw the envelope, something in his expression changed, like he already knew what it was. He took it carefully, hands steady, and peeled the flap open with the kind of reverence most people save for funerals. Inside was a single page, handwritten, ink slightly smeared in places, the edges warped from time and heat. JD stood in the middle of the lobby and began to read. If you're holding this, it means I didn't make it home. Or maybe I did, but time caught up with me before I could get to him. Ranger's not just a dog. He's not a tool. He's not some surplus gear you can retire. He's family. The room was silent. Phones stopped ringing. Staff stopped moving. Ranger, lying near the front desk now, lifted his head at the sound of JD's voice. He saved my life more times than I can count. He lay next to me when I couldn't sleep. He stood between me and the worst of the world without ever asking why. If you find him, if he ends up alone, somehow, don't let him die thinking we forgot. Don't let him think we didn't care. JD paused, blinked. His voice cracked slightly, but didn't falter. We owe them more than a thank you. We owe them a home. By the time he folded the letter and looked up, the lobby was full. Staff, volunteers, strangers who had walked in for adoption forms and frozen in place, unable to move. Someone was crying quietly near the door. JD didn't say another word. He just walked over, placed the letter on the counter, and knelt beside Ranger. The dog didn't bark, didn't wag, just leaned forward and rested his chin gently on JD's knee, eyes closed. That moment was captured on a phone by someone in the back. It went online within minutes, and by nightfall, the letter had been heard by millions. Not just read, but felt. In homes, in barracks, in cars parked on quiet streets, and everywhere it played, people came to the same realization. Ranger hadn't been forgotten. He'd just been waiting to be found. 2 days after the letter went public, the shelter's front doors opened to something it hadn't seen in years. Hope lined up on the sidewalk. Not the kind scribbled onto adoption papers or whispered between volunteers, but the kind that stood proud, waiting to walk through change. Cameras were parked respectfully across the street. Veterans stood quietly beside civilians, and staff moved with the kind of purpose that only comes when something has truly shifted. Inside, the air was different. Not because the walls were new or the kennels cleaner, but because every person in the building knew the world had watched and decided to care, and they weren't going back. The director stepped forward with JD at her side, her voice steady as she addressed the waiting crowd. Effective immediately, no veteran service animal will ever be euthanized at this shelter without a full, independent review. Not again. Not ever. The words were simple, but they landed like thunder. JD didn't speak first. He just nodded, then turned toward the hallway, now bearing a new sign above its archway. The Ranger Wing. 6 kennels. Each one now fitted with new bedding, climate control, and reinforced privacy panels designed to reduce stress for aging or traumatized dogs. On the far wall hung a framed photograph of Ranger, seated calmly, eyes locked on something unseen, but not unfelt. Beneath it, a brass plaque with 16 engraved words, for those who served without words, but with everything else. JD stepped up to the plaque and rested his hand on the wall beside it. "This isn't a donation," he said, voice low but clear. "This is a debt, one we should have paid a long time ago." Behind him, a boy about 12 years old held his father's hand, both of them watching Ranger, now lounging peacefully near the front desk, his vest embroidered with a patch that read, "Retired, not forgotten." The shelter director turned to JD. "It's more than we ever expected." He shook his head. "It's exactly what they deserved." For the rest of the day, people came and went. Not just adopters, but former handlers, families of veterans, kids who brought drawings of dogs in uniform. A Vietnam vet in a wheelchair rolled up to the front counter and slipped a $20 bill into the donation jar, then looked at Ranger and gave a quiet salute. Ranger didn't move, but his tail tapped once against the floor. As the sun set, the final tour of the Ranger Wing passed through. JD lingered behind, watching the space breathe with new life. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was permanent. A corner of the world that now knew what dignity looked like and chose to protect it. For every dog like Ranger, for every handler who never got to come back, and for every unspoken bond that still waits to be honored. The ride to JD's home was quiet. No fanfare, no film crew trailing behind. Just a weathered German shepherd sitting in the back seat of a dark sedan, eyes steady, head slightly tilted as the trees passed by the window like silent spectators. JD didn't say much on the drive. He didn't need to. Every few minutes, he'd glance in the mirror, catching Ranger's reflection, always alert, always waiting, like he was still scanning for danger in a world that had long moved on. But this wasn't a mission. This was something else entirely. When they pulled into the driveway, JD opened the door and waited. Ranger stepped out slowly, joints stiff but spirit unbroken, nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar air. JD didn't tug the leash. He just held it loose, walking up the porch steps like he was leading an old friend home after a long deployment. Inside, the house was warm, quiet, no clutter or noise. JD had already prepared the corner of the entryway with a thick padded mat and a water bowl, but Ranger didn't head there. Instead, he walked the perimeter of each room first, slow and deliberate, circling the space with the kind of instinct you never train out. He paused at every window, checked every door, then returned to the front of the house, laid down beside the entryway, and exhaled. Not a sigh of exhaustion, a release. Like he'd been waiting to belong somewhere again, and now he did. JD stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him. "You're not a guest here," he said. "You're home." That night, Ranger didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply curled into himself near the front door and rested his chin on his paws, eyes half closed but always watching. Not guarding out of habit, but out of something deeper, something closer to love. JD sat nearby on the old leather couch, reading a folder of pending bills and policy memos, but his focus kept drifting. Every time his eyes landed on Ranger, a piece of the day unraveled from his chest. The war, the shelter, the moments of almost lost and nearly forgotten. All of it now resting peacefully in a home built not on duty, but on memory. The following mornings settled into rhythm. Ranger would stretch quietly, rise to inspect the perimeter of the porch, then return inside before the kettle finished boiling. He didn't ask for attention, but when JD reached down to scratch behind his ear, Ranger leaned into it. No hesitation, no fear, just trust. Visitors noticed quickly the way he moved from room to room, like he was still part of a unit, the way he sat beside JD during interviews or waited patiently by the door when he left the house. One veteran friend summed it up best. "He doesn't look like a dog," the man said, eyes soft. "He looks like a chapter that didn't get closed right, until now." And every night when JD turned off the final light, Ranger stayed by the door. Not because he had to, but because for the first time in a long time, he was protecting something real. A place, a person, a legacy. The ceremony wasn't held in a grand hall or beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Capitol. It was held in JD's living room, the curtains drawn open just enough to let the winter sunlight spill across the hardwood floor. The space was quiet, dignified, filled with a few close faces, veterans in dress blues, a chaplain, a colonel who had once served with Ranger's unit, and a handful of men and women who knew what it meant to be protected without asking why. Ranger sat near the fireplace, fur dusted with gray now, eyes a little cloudier than before, but still focused, still calm. He didn't understand the flags or the brass pins or why the room was filled with so many straight-backed shoulders and solemn hands, but he stayed still, as always, watching, waiting. JD stood beside him, wearing a dark suit, his hand resting gently on Ranger's back. The colonel stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. His voice was low but certain. "This commendation comes from the Department of Defense for acts of service during Operation Iron Shield, for the detection of explosive devices and the prevention of loss of life under active engagement, for bravery, for loyalty, for completing the mission." He opened the box, revealing a military service medal, a silver star affixed to a blue and gold ribbon. He held it toward JD. "This belongs to him," he said, "and to every handler who couldn't be here to pin it himself." JD took the box with both hands, not as a gesture of ownership, but of memory. He turned and stepped toward the mantel, where a framed photo already waited. Ranger and Staff Sergeant Brennan, standing side by side in the desert sun, faces covered in grit, eyes locked forward, a bond forged in silence. JD placed the box gently beside it. No speeches, no clapping, just a few quiet breaths, and a moment that carried more weight than anything typed on official letterhead. Ranger remained near the hearth, unmoving, ears still alert, even as the room began to relax. The colonel stepped back, removed his hat, and gave the old shepherd a long, respectful nod. "Thank you, soldier." That night, after the guests had left and the house had settled into its usual quiet, JD sat on the couch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Ranger rested nearby, his breathing steady, his body curled in the same spot he'd claimed since the day he arrived. JD looked toward the mantel. The medal caught the light just enough to glint, not as a decoration, but as a correction. Because some honors aren't about ceremony, they're about dignity. And some heroes don't wear uniforms. They wear fur, carry scars no one sees, and never stop watching the door. Ranger didn't need the medal. He didn't need the plaque or the policy change. But the world needed the reminder that sometimes the bravest among us never say a word. They just stay. Some stories don't need a spotlight. They just need someone to stop and see what's already there. Ranger didn't ask to be rescued. He didn't ask to go viral. All he ever did was serve, with loyalty, with courage, and without a single word. And when the world nearly forgot him, it took one man and one moment to remind us all what we owe to those who gave everything without asking for anything in return. Now, his story lives on, not in a file cabinet, but in a home, on a mantle, in a policy that ensures no other hero like him will be discarded again. If this story moved you, if you believe in honoring those who can't speak for themselves, those who served in silence, then don't just watch. Stay with us. Subscribe. Because the next story might be waiting right now, behind another kennel door, behind another scar. And together, we can make sure no one like Ranger ever goes unseen again. Subscribe to hear the next one, because some heroes don't speak, but their stories still deserve to be heard.